Hey everybody, I'm Amanda with DevExpress and welcome to today's webinar, Building Your First Blazor App, presented by DevExpress Technical Evangelist Paul Usher, DevExpress CTO Julian Bucknall, and we have a very special guest appearance by none other than Carl Franklin. Carl
Hello.
Franklin is Executive Vice President of AppVNext, a software development firm focused on modern methodologies and technologies. Carl is a 20-plus year veteran of the software industry, co-host and founder of .NET Rocks, the first and most widely listened to podcast for .NET developers, a Microsoft MVP for developer technologies, and senior executive of PWOP Studios, a full-service audio and video production post-production studio located in southeastern Connecticut. Having completed the first leg of the Blazor Roadshow, it is now time to answer some common questions surrounding Microsoft's latest offering. In this presentation, you'll learn the difference between client and server-side models, how to incorporate DevExpress Blazor components within your project, and see why the Blazor framework is a game changer for developers. This session is being recorded and it will be made available on our DevExpress YouTube channel later today, and we will send the link to the recording in a follow-up email. We will also do a live Q&A at the end of this presentation. Just type your questions in the GoToWebinar control panel at any time throughout the broadcast. We do have two very quick poll questions for you before we get started, and here is the first one. Have you started using Blazor yet? It's pretty easy. Select one of the following, yes or no. So I'll give everyone a second to get in their answers. Let's see. All right. I'm just going to give people time to answer. Oh, so I have about 77% no, 23%, 25% yes, 75% no. All right. And then our second question, do you plan on using client-side or server-side? If you are going to use Blazor, do you plan on using client-side or server-side? Looks like that's a 55% client-side, 45% server-side. Give everyone just a second to get their answers in. There's a lot of you on this webinar today. All right, so yeah, it looks like 55, 45, almost a pretty even split. All right. 59% client-side, 41% server-side. All right. All right. Thank you very much for your responses, and thank you so much for joining us. I will now hand things over to Paul, Julian, and Carl.
Thank you, Amanda, and good morning, everyone. Now, at the moment, I'm still seeing a poll screen up, so Carl, you should be sharing your screen shortly, I believe. And in the meantime, let's say good morning to Julian.
Good morning, Paul, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to this rather special webinar on Blazor, what it is, what it does, how it works, how to make it better, has it been released yet, and so on and so forth. And of course, to do that, we could not do it without the expertise of Mr. Carl Franklin. Carl, are you there?
Yes, I am. How are you?
Doing very well, thank you. Doing very well indeed. Welcome to DevExpress and welcome to your first DevExpress webinar. And let's move on. I know we have quite a bit to cover here today, so less chit-chat and more facts.
Let's start with a quick, obviously, a big shout out to Carl, because it's unusual for him to be the one being interviewed and obviously a connoisseur at presenting. Carl, you've just finished leg one of the Blazor Roadshow. Give us a quick rundown on how that's going and how people are responding out there to it.
We are busting attendance records all over the United States at these local meetup groups for .NET meetup groups. We started on the East Coast and did 2 weeks out there. Now we're on the West Coast, and same deal. Last night in San Diego, for example, they had a record number of people turn out and less drop-offs as well. So that's it's been very telling. People are really hungry for sort of definitive answers about Blazor, what it is and where it's going. And, people are kind of on the fence about it for various reasons. And so, when a guy like me comes out and says, this is like the best thing I've ever used for web development, and guys like Rocky Latka are right behind me, then people tend to take that more seriously, I think.
So you had
Sorry,
Rocky there last night?
No, but Richard Campbell and I interviewed Rocky yesterday.
I got you.
And he was like, he's got a completely new version of CSLA.NET that supports Blazor bindings, and he's completely gung-ho. Like, we're in complete agreement as to the momentous occasion that is right now, especially where WebAssembly is concerned.
Marvelous.
So let's maybe hit some of those frequently asked questions first, and there's a couple that we want to get through.
Sure.
Why would a developer choose Blazor over typical or many of the other frameworks that's around?
Sure. The short flip answer is because we hate JavaScript.
No, I love it. Get out of here.
If you're a dinosaur.
Well, not everybody hates JavaScript, but I'll tell you what, though, enterprise developers, of which your customers are many, kind of haven't been this excited about a technology, a .NET technology, since Silverlight. And I noticed that that's another frequently asked question. We'll get to that in a minute. But, after Silverlight was no longer usable because it wouldn't go on iOS devices, and all the browsers kind of got rid of the plugin model, they kind of got forced into using JavaScript and Ajax and all this stuff. And some did it well, and others are still, not happy with the state of enterprise development using JavaScript frameworks, Angular. I mean, it's complex. There's a lot more plumbing code involved. You sort of have to have a whole stack of tools and libraries, and those stacks are sort of divided into tribes. So if you're in the Angular tribe, or you're, and then, of course, with all the other technologies that go along with web development, there's a lot to learn. And so it's my opinion that enterprise developers just want to get stuff done, and they want to use the least amount of code, the least amount of brain power to get the most bang for the buck with some solutions that are, secure and powerful and reliable, and get the job done. That's what they want. So like I said, I have never felt more productive, even since WinForms. I think WinForms was even less productive than using Blazor. I'm just like amazed at how much they've simplified the component model, and how easy it is to get started and to continue to do complete applications. It's just wonderful. So that's why you choose Blazor, I think. If you're already down the Angular path, or React or Vue or one of these SPA frameworks that use JavaScript, and you're comfortable with that, and your team's on board, and you're productive and great, have at it, man. But however, if you're an enterprise developer tasked with delivering web software, and you're struggling with all of that stuff, and you do know C#, and you like C#, then this is worth looking at.
It certainly is an amazing framework. In some respects, I can't believe how easy it is to get up and running with what they've done. So the next question, I know this one's a hot debate. There's a lot of opinion around it. Should people be focusing on server side or client side? And maybe just give us a quick brief as to what the difference is.
Sure. With each of these hosting models, I just want to stress that the component model, or the UI and the code, can be exactly the same. You can take code that runs in WebAssembly and run it as a server-side app. Once you have created an app, though, it's really hard to change from one to the other, but you could certainly either, copy in those resources, or, compile them into assemblies and then use them that way. So the client side is obviously where Blazor started. Blazor started as a project Steve Sanderson from Microsoft did to explore whether C# could run in the browser on WebAssembly. And WebAssembly is like a virtual machine that's built into all the modern browsers, and they all support it. It's not in preview. It's not an option, and it's there. WebAssembly is here to stay. There's a whole bunch of programming languages that you can use to compile to WebAssembly, and Blazor is Microsoft's cross-platform mono CLR running on WebAssembly that will load any .NET Standard 2 assemblies or run any code that's .NET Standard 2 compatible, which is just about everything. So that's the WebAssembly version, Blazor Client. Blazor Server will take that same code and use that code, except that it adds a SignalR service in between the browser and the server. And you do need a server to run it, whereas WebAssembly will just load up in the browser just like a HTML and JavaScript would, right? It can be served on a CDN, for example, whereas the server side requires a server, requires a little bit of overhead for every client. And then there's this built-in SignalR hub that you don't see, you don't get to dig into, but it's there. And it creates a one-to-one client connection along, a persistent connection between the server and each client. And it's just for UI changes. So it's very efficient. There's a binary protocol that happens. So you, for example, click a button, and the local Blazor JavaScript library hooks the DOM and says, oh, that button click, that's a Blazor on click. So it packages up a little binary message and sends it over the wire to the server. The server says, oh, they clicked the button. And now that is bound to a local method. I'll run that local method, and now we maybe change some variables that are updating in the binding of the controls. And the server side, Blazor keeps a graph of every client's DOM in memory. So then after it applies the changes to its own DOM on the server side, it finds the difference and says, oh, well, this span updated, that div updated, whatever. So then it sends those messages back down to the client, and then the client updates the DOM. And all that happens automatically behind the scenes. You can log it, you can watch the traffic, but if you want your own SignalR hub for your own purposes, you can always add that. So that's the difference.
What I'm hearing in that sense, though, is therefore server side is going to be based on server size, scalability, and
yes,
the dollar.
That's right. And so if you want to offload all of the stuff that would normally run in the client, you want to offload that and just handle it all on the server, and you can scale up. You have memory is a constraint. If you want to use a web farm situation, you can do that, but now you have to move the SignalR to an Azure service to get it outside of any one box. And you also have to implement state management, where you have to save the state of the DOM essentially yourself. There isn't any sort of guidance right now as to how to do that, but it's certainly doable. And but those are things that you have to think of. Maybe you just purchase a virtual machine that has enough memory and CPU power to support the number of users that you want. And in the test that Microsoft did, they could, with a 4 virtual CPU and 14 gig of RAM server in Azure, they could support 20,000 plus concurrent client connections. So, depending on how much money you have, you can really scale this thing up.
Mm. So let's talk about the elephant in the room then, because a lot of objections I get or questions I get when I'm presenting on Blazor is the whole Silverlight thing. And I know you've done a short video for us on that, but tell us why it's not just another Silverlight.
So I was talking on .NET Rocks recently to a very well-known and very well-respected JavaScript guy who's all about performance. And, when I asked, and he hasn't really looked into Blazor at all, but he felt compelled to offer his uninformed opinion. Flash and Silverlight died for a reason. And I actually took him to task on that. I got quite upset because that in that flip kind of statement is a whole bunch of assumptions, right? That anytime we're running anything but JavaScript in a browser, we have a security problem, right? And the security problems around Flash and Silverlight had to do with the plugin model, not with Flash as a platform or Silverlight as a platform. But the plugin model was the only thing that browsers supported to allow any other kind of code to run. And of course, that was causing iOS devices, iPhones and iPads, to just absolutely drain their batteries while people were using Flash. And at that time, we were expecting Silverlight to be able to run on iOS and devices. And so Steve Jobs said also, there was a lot of malware that was entering via the plugin model. So it was clearly a problem. And Steve Jobs famously wrote that blog post, Thoughts on Flash, or white paper. And he basically said, you know what, as much as it pains me to do this, we're disabling our support for plugins. So no more Flash, and Silverlight obviously was a casualty of that decision as well. And I think people said, well, if I can't run my Silverlight apps on an iPad, which is the hottest new upcoming platform, and it looks like all the browsers are following suit and they're taking out support for plugins, then Silverlight is dead. Of course, Silverlight is still, you could still write in Silverlight, it's just that it doesn't run anywhere. So that's the problem with Silverlight. Whereas Blazor is an implementation of a WebAssembly language, and WebAssembly is built into all the browsers. And here's the key, kids. Your code runs in the same sandbox that JavaScript runs in. So there's no more of a security threat for running C# code in the browser than there is for running JavaScript in the browser. And all the same kind of rules apply. You don't give your secrets out in the JavaScript that runs on the client. It should just be for UI. Any sensitive code should run on the server. And even if you're running WebAssembly Blazor client, you can call into API controllers to do the real work. Or those controllers could kick off services, could kick off web jobs. You have the whole gamut of server-side code that you can run. So no, it is not just another Silverlight, not even close. I might add that Blazor is one of the only runtimes that runs in WebAssembly, whereas these other languages mostly are compiled and run as binary apps, compiled to WebAssembly. Whereas the only thing that's compiled to WebAssembly here is the runtime, the mono runtime. And then the DLLs, the assemblies, just get loaded in there.
You mentioned earlier on modern browsers. I take it that means Internet Explorer 11 isn't included in that?
Correct. Internet Explorer 11, the last version of Internet Explorer, isn't being brought forward into the modern world. And so, Microsoft switched over to working on Edge as their browser. So yes, if you have... if you're an enterprise and you're still supporting Internet Explorer 11, then obviously Blazor server is a better is your only option here with Blazor. And even then, you're going to need a polyfill. But just as a matter of talking point here, you shouldn't be supporting Internet Explorer 11. There better be a really good reason, because the browser isn't being updated anymore. You may run into potential security problems in the future. I mean, anytime that some company stops working on a particular browser, that it leaves it open for hackers and exploiters to take advantage of what's in there.
Totally agree. Totally agree.
All right. The last question that I raised there was about hosting, which we won't spend a lot of time on because you mentioned it can only be hosted on .NET Core.
Yeah.
And so how about we jump in and you start showing us through some of this cool stuff?
Yeah, I'd love to. So I've got Visual Studio here, and I'm using the latest version of Visual Studio Community 2019. This is a free version of Visual Studio, and so far in all of my online webinars, classes, training, have never had any kind of impediment when it comes to developing Blazor apps or web apps or any kind of .NET applications. The differences between this and Pro and Enterprise have mostly to do with testing and things like that. But you can just go ahead and download for free Visual Studio 2019 Preview. You do have to, because WebAssembly is in preview, you do have to install the template. But if you just Google Bing, getting started with Blazor, and go to the first Microsoft link there, the documentation is really clear what you have to do.
Yeah, a couple of PowerShell scripts, I think.
What's that?
A quick couple of PowerShell scripts.
Exactly. And not even PowerShell scripts. You can just drop to a command line and use the .NET script to install a template. So if you have that installed, you will see the Blazor WebAssembly app as an option. But we're just going to go with Blazor Server app. This support has been in the framework since .NET Core 3. So this requires a preview. Also, WebAssembly will be baked in May, and this is what the team has said. That means, I suppose, that you can start coding against it in May without fear that something's going to change on you requiring a rewrite. And then the expectation is that it will ship with .NET 5 in November, which is sort of the grand unification .NET. It's no longer called Core. Everything's Core, and even the stuff that's Windows specific is running on top of .NET Core. So I'm going to go ahead and create one called Blazor Server here. Here we go. And the canonical demo is right here, this counter razor. I don't know if you guys can see, but you get this pages folder, and there's some .razor files in here. These are pages. And over here, I've got some HTML right here, and I'm showing this variable current count, which I've defined in this code block as an integer, just with the @ sign. So there's a little paragraph here that says current count and then the number. I have a button here with an @onClick handler. Now, if I remove that @, that is a directive to run a JavaScript method on click. But with the @ sign, that's a directive to Blazor that says, oh, this is going to be a server-side increment count method. And you don't have to have run @ equals server, none of that stuff. It's just using the @ sign. And so that's pretty simple, right? We could even set a breakpoint here. Now I'm going to remind you as I run this code is running on the server. So there's my counter page, and I click. There's current count, get a breakpoint, and automatically this just happens, right? Because remember I told you about that SignalR stuff? Well, let's actually watch this. I'm going to bring up my network tools, and I'm going to disable the cache. See right there, I disabled the cache. I'm going to press Control F5. Oh, I got to start recording my network traffic. I'll press Control F5. All right, here you go. Let's look. 423K was transferred. And also notice that this guy right here, _Blazor, !ID equals blah, blah, blah. This is the SignalR connection. And if I look at messages, let me actually expand this a little bit. I look at the messages, and I can clear these messages, hit the counter, And now you can see that 3 messages have occurred. The first one is client to server, 291 bytes. Then 148 bytes come down, and then we do a acknowledgement with 27 bytes. Very, very economical. So this is one of the benefits of server-side Blazor, is that it's very efficient in terms of data that is being sent and received. Only, think of it like Ajax. You only ask for the data that's going to update, and that's what you get back. The difference being, of course, you don't see any plumbing code here, right? Now,
So
here's another. Yeah, go ahead.
Just to emphasize, if you like, SignalR is essentially a communications channel which is always open between the server and the client. Is that right?
Correct. It's a persistent connection. So unlike, MVC applications or just any kind of standard internet, web application, when the browser makes you click a button, you navigate whatever, somewhere, an HTTP request is being made, whether it's in JavaScript or whatever, and a socket connection is made to that server over port 80, which is open on most firewalls. And then the server does what it needs to do with that request and sends an HTTP response back to the browser. And then the server severs that socket's connection. That socket, it just closes the connection. WebSockets, on the other hand, stay open. And SignalR just kind of abstracts all that stuff away from you. You can add your own SignalR hubs if you want to, but the idea is that you connect and you stay connected.
Gotcha.
And then you can send data to the client, to the server can send data to you, you can do push notifications, like all of that stuff just works. And that's the difference. So there isn't any HTTP, traffic here. This is all, not that you can see, it's all going over SignalR. Yeah.
All right, brilliant.
Now, let's add a WebAssembly project here. And I'll add another application here, and I'm going to call this Blazor WASM. Here's the WebAssembly app. I'm going to check this off right here, ASP.NET Core hosted. And that means not only do I get a WebAssembly app that I can run, but I'm also going to get an ASP.NET 3.1 Core server app that will host it. And, because I want to add some controllers, I want to be able to call controllers in the same URL space without requiring cores. So that's what you see here, the server, the Blazor WASM server. This right here, Blazor WASM client, is what's going to run in the browser. It's going to run on the server side, but only to serve that browser client. And then there's a shared project as well where you can put models that will be used by both sides. So right now, I will set the startup project to Blazor WASM server, and we'll take a look at that. And we'll even go so far as to run this in an incognito window. Just because I don't want any kind of caching or any of that. I'll disable my cache again. You can see that, right? Start recording. I'll go to counter and I'll press Control F5 here. Oh, well, that's a little bit different, right? Whereas we only got a few things downloaded with the server side. Now we've got a whole bunch of stuff, including this. Look at this, .NET WASM. That's the mono runtime, and it's only 828K, but that is the largest file that got downloaded. All in all, 2.1 megs were downloaded. Now,
and to be fair, that's going to be cached if you're running this thing regularly anyway.
That's right. This is only the first time you go there. Now, the user has control over their cache. So if they press F5, not a whole lot is happening. Okay, well, I'm disabling the cache. But if the cache wasn't disabled, I press F5, you wouldn't have to re-download all of this stuff. But here we go. Check this out. When I do the click me, I don't see any traffic over here because it's all running in the browser. And also notice that it's the same code. All right, there's the server. Now we go to client counter. It's the same exact code. So the only difference here is that in the server side fetch data, and let's just do a quick fetch data demo here. The output is the same. We're getting some dummy data, and it is really dummy data. It's, you know, look, 114 degrees Fahrenheit is apparently freezing. So this is obviously just random data. But the way it's served is different, and it's just to show the differences between client and server side. On the server side, fetch data just loads this local forecast service that it has in the data folder, and that forecast service is added as a singleton to the services, and in counter, not in counter, in fetch data, it's injected with a forecast service with the @inject directive, and we just call it, get some data. But on the client side, fetch data injects an HTTP client, and that HTTP client is calling getJSON async as an array of weather forecasts to call the weather forecast controller. Notice it doesn't have a whole complete URL here. That's because we're being served from this server, which is in the same URL space. So no need for you know, a complete URL. But of course, this is just, you know, an HTTP GET. This can come from anywhere. So that's the difference. Now, one more quick demo I want to show you before I hand it back, and that is how to run both and develop both a server-side app and a client-side app at the same time. Because currently, check this out. I'm going to run in the client. I'm going to hit set a breakpoint here. I'm still running the WebAssembly version. And if I click that counter button, one would expect that breakpoint would catch it, but it doesn't. That's because as of this preview, debugging in Visual Studio of WASM Blazor app is not supported. But you certainly could develop it. And here's how. Check this out. What I'm going to do is, just to show you that this is going to work, I'm going to delete the pages from the server-side app. It's a little trick that I learned from Steve Sanderson. I'm going to add a reference, and actually, I learned it from Don, because Don Weiber was actually in Steve Sanderson's talk, and he saw this, and I asked him, you know, where's the white paper, where's the blog post? And he goes, no, it's just over here in my GitHub repo, a little demo, and here's the line of code that does it. So very modest, man.
We love the work Don does.
Yeah. So I'm adding a reference.
You guys.
Yeah, thank you, Don. I'm adding a reference from Blazor server to Blazor client, the client in the shared folder. I'm going to go into the host _host CSHTML on the server side. This is essentially where you define the app, and this app is your entire UI. All the pages, all the code are represented in this object. So if I change this to Blazor WASM .client.app and then change my mode to server, now we're going to be running the code in the client project, but on the server. Follow me? So if I want to run both of these at the same time, I can. So I'm going to go to Solution Properties and select Multiple Startup Projects. I'm going to run the Blazor Server project and the WASM Server project, because this one runs the WebAssembly in a browser, and this one runs the server side in a browser, but they're both going to be using the same exact code base. And I'm just doing a rebuild here, make sure everything's happy and works and there's no bin and object files sticking around, object folders, bin folders. Now when I run this guy, I get two browsers, and you can tell which is which because this one at the top says Blazor Server, because that's my Blazor Server project. This one says Blazor WASM. So on the WASM side, now remember I deleted all the pages from the server app, so that tells you this is actually running client-side code on the server. Here's my fetch data. All right, on the Blazor Server app, you know I got my counter. Now when I go to fetch data, boom. This is what happens when you have an unhandled exception. See browser DevTools for details. Yeah, I really don't like having my users to go into the browser tools for anything. But, you know, if we do take a look here, it says there's no registered service of type systemnet HTTP client because remember we injected that HTTP client? Well, we didn't need it on the server, so it's not on the server side. So, and also, that fetch data code is using that HTTP with a URL that isn't in scope on the server. So the first thing we have to do is in Blazor server side, let's add the HTTP client. And then go into fetch data. The only one we have now is on the client. And I'll change this to HTTPS localhost and some port number that we can find where the controller is. Right here in this WASM server. Go to launch settings. There's my SSL port right there. So this URL now is explicitly going to our Blazor WASM server. Now we should be able to run this from both the client, the same code from both the client and the server. So the moral of the story here is that you have to have the same resources if you're going to do this little trick. You have to have the same resources on both the server and the client. And by resources, I don't mean UI and Blazor code. I mean the stuff that's going to run in that environment, which is in the startup and JavaScript and all of those things. The URL I had to change just because of where we are. So there you go.
That's cool. Couple of things that I'd like to show. First
Sure.
of all, you added the scoped entry in there for the HTTP client before, but let's run the example up of if I wanted to persist some data across my session. Well, I say session, but
Sure.
if I'm switching pages.
Yeah, absolutely. So check out the counter.razor right here. And now, I think I'm going to have to just do this on the startup side, but because I deleted my counter page. But if you have the counter and you notice that when you click the counter increment button on either of these, if I click the counter and then I go to another page and back to the counter, it's 0 again. And the reason is that the state of your page, or in this case, current count, every variable, everything that's in memory gets reinitialized when you navigate to a page. So let's just do this on the client side. I'm going to add on the client side a class called appState. In an appState, I'll create a public int counter. All right, now over in the startup on the server side, because I don't have a startup on the client side, they took that out. You can add your own, but it's beyond the scope of this demo. So here I will add services.addScoped app state, and doesn't know where that app state is just yet. But we do have a reference to it. It's in Blazor WASM client. Okay. And now I go into my counter page, and I can inject app state. I can get rid of this altogether and just increment that app state counter increment. And what I'll show here is app state counter. So now I have this class app state where all of the stuff that I want to persist between page initializations is stored. Now I'll go to Blazor server, and I'm updating, clicking the count button. Then I can go to fetch data, and I can come back to counter, and it's still 7.
Excellent.
Okay. So that persists data between page initializations, but if I pressed, F5 and refresh the page, then all this stuff would be reinitialized as well. So the next step for you, if you say want to run Blazor server apps, say in a web farm where you have a bunch of containers, the first thing you need to do is offload SignalR to Azure SignalR service, right? Because you don't want that stuck to any one server. And the second thing you need to do is use that app state to persist and retrieve the state, preferably from some document database. Now on the client, that's going to be different, because on the client, you want to know, you want to be able to save it to, say, local storage, right? Your code is running on the client. You have the state in the browser, and you should be persisting that state somewhere where you can reload it. Make sense?
Absolutely. Well, let's take a quick look then at the difference in plumbing requirements between a boilerplate Blazor app and when you start injecting some of the DevExpress Blazor components.
Yeah, sure. So I will actually show you a demo that I have running here, actually. That is the same demo that I've been showing on the Roadshow, but it's using a DevExpress grid control. And so there's 2 DevExpress grids here. One to create a new instrument, and I can just do that very easily. I can delete instruments, I can edit them, all the CRUD stuff, and I can create new musicians and select the instruments that they'll be playing, right? So this demo is very succinct. What I've had to do is go create a NuGet source, and then I went to manage NuGet packages, and I pulled that source down, and you register yourself with DevExpress Blazor, and you get this URL to the NuGet feed. But then you just browse DevExpress for Blazor, include the previews, and there it is right there. So you can just install it. And then there's just a couple of other things that you need to do. Add DevExpress Blazor to your services, and in your pages, you add, and I don't even have it here, but there's a style sheet that you have for server-side Blazor. On the client side, you can add it right here in index.html. But I didn't even have it in this demo. But you know, DevExpress controls have certain styles, so that's what you would do. Oh no, it's right here. It's right there. DevExpress Blazor.
And how much difference did it make comparing the version that uses the DevExpress components to your original template?
Yeah, let me load. Let me first load the original version here, and I'll show you what it looks like. While that's loading up, let's just go to index.html, not index.html, index Razor, and I'll show you that this is the UI for, just the UI for defining the grid for instruments, and this is the UI for musicians, the grid, not a whole lot. If you look at the code behind, that is also pretty small. Here's all the stuff for supporting instruments. Here's all the code for supporting musicians. Now, take a look at this. In the actual app, I've got my index Razor that has code for musicians, instruments, like so. Each of these has an editor. So here's my instrument editor and all the code. Here's my musician editor and all that code. That uses an object picker, which is for selecting instruments, but it's generic. And here's all the code for object picker. So you're getting the idea? I didn't even show you the code behind it in the index page itself. Like,
so that's a big difference. It makes it a lot.
This is the code, yeah, for instruments right there. Here's the code for musicians, like, you know, and yeah, so there's quite a big difference. If I was to look at DevExpress controls online, some great demos here of Blazor. One that just really absolutely blows me away is the scheduler. So this is like dropping Google Calendar into your application. And I can move events around, I can overlap them, I can change their name, I can add new events. I'll add one here. All right, and edit all of that. So yeah, this is amazing. Now here's the cool part. That's the code. What we were just doing.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
All the heavy lifting's done for you.
Yes. Yeah.
And of course, looking at the list there, there's the data grid, pip grid, there's charts, there's
right.
And the list just simply continues to get bigger and better.
Exactly. You can change the theme just by changing your Bootstrap CSS file. It's just really good stuff. Really great. And it also supports my opinion that enterprise developers just want to get stuff done. And so while Blazor is a vast improvement over JavaScript frameworks, you saw how easy it was. Using grids and charts and schedulers and data editors and all those things from DevExpress makes you even more productive. So there's real value that relates to real money, saving real money here.
All right, I've got one question for you, and then I'm going to hand it over to Julian to run through some more. Just jump back into Visual Studio for me, Carl, if you don't mind.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
One thing that certainly frustrates me, and I get asked a lot of questions, is you create a Razor page and you're expected to do your blend of HTML and your C# in the page.
Oh, yeah.
It's not just a matter of the old days where you'd create the .cs file in the background. So just take us through a quick example of doing that.
Yeah, sure. Why don't I just start with this. In my index page, I'll do some binding here. And I'll show you, I'll just write some more code other than, whatever the index is here so that we can see the difference. I'll just do a quick demo of binding. This is the bind syntax here, @bind equals message, and my message is just a string property. And I can, type updated here, and then when I lose focus by pressing tab, that change occurs. But I can also override the event that triggers that change by saying @bind::event equals, and then the event, which I'll change to on input. So now every keystroke is going to update that message and make the change happen. Just very elegant code. So I'll just show you this really quickly, and then I'll move that code to a code behind file. Okay?
Yeah, that's cool.
Very cool. All right, so let's say we want to take this code and move it to a class. Well, the first thing let's do is I'm just going to delete this code right there, copy it to the clipboard, delete the code block, and then to my pages folder I'll add a class called index.razor.cs. So the convention is whatever your Razor component is, add a .cs to the end of it. It has to be a partial class, and it has to derive from component base. Component base is in the ASP.NET Blazor components, Razor components, come on, sorry, what I'm using. ASP.NET Core.components, and now add that string, but it can't be private. Let's make it protected, that string property. And now everything works the way you'd expect it to. One of the key differences is, you get the full experience of the Visual Studio editor this way. It's a real class, it's testable. Whereas if it's just in a code block, some things don't work the way you want them to. Like you can't press Control, period, and bring up, the refactorings and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Excellent. So it's that simple.
Yep. I do have one more thing to show if you'd like me to show it.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. I'm going to create a component in Pages, and this is how you create any kind of component or page. It's going to be a Razor component. So this is anything that inherits from component base, which Pages also do. But I'll call this child component. And in child component, I'll copy in some code here. All right. Child component, we've got these parameters. And parameters kind of equate to public properties that you can set when you instantiate the component. And you can bind to them, and you can set them, and you can also define events. So as I said before, the component model in Blazor is really, really elegant. And they've simplified even things like making events in classes. This is it, event callback that passes a string, and the event name is message changed. Now up here, I've just got a div with some padding, change the background color to light gray. Of course, you can use CSS and styles. I just did this inline. And I've got a parent message here. That's my parent message, which is a string, also a parameter. And my button on click updates the message. So in update message, I set parent message to blaze on, and I invoke the event message changed. Now back in index Razor, and I have to do this in 2 steps because I have this as the code block. I don't need that message. All right. All I've done is changed, I got my bind message, bind on input, but now I've instantiated that child component, and I'm binding to the parent message property. And this is how you bind to a specific property, bind-property name. I'm binding my message, which is in my code behind right here, binding that to the parent message of the child component. And the event that's going to change that parent message is message changed. So I've basically short-circuited my way around writing an event handler and then updating the message. So this is a really good demo of how you can bind to a component. And then update whatever you're bound to from inside the component. So here's my two-way bound message, updating from parent, right? There's all the way we have a one-way binding up here. There's a two-way binding here, and a two-way binding here because we can change it from within inside the component. How cool is that? And how elegant is that model? Look at this.
Yeah, the plumbing is so simple.
It's so simple, right? Yeah. So that's what I got today.
All right, we'll hand over to Julian to go through some questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. You did a bit of coding there, and obviously you didn't make any mistakes because you are Carl Franklin. But when will debugging arrive? Do you know?
Well, I don't know, but I'm assuming that they'll have that in by May. That's their target, is to make everything working and available by May, which probably means build. They'll probably announce it at build.
Oh, that's true. That's true. It is in May, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they haven't said they'll announce it at build, but one might speculate just because they said May and build's in May. And then that's when I'm expecting that to be there. But who knows? They may have a release before that.
Okay. Let me see. Let me just put it like this. We've had many questions, and the team behind the scenes have been answering these questions. So essentially, I'll just be pointing out some really interesting ones. One for DevExpress customers especially is, do you have any version of XAF using Blazor? And the answer to that is, yeah, we've got a roadmap for it. We're experimenting internally. So, please go to our blogs. You'll scroll down a bit and there you'll be able to see our XAF for Blazor roadmap. Lots of questions like, when will DevExpress have a, reporting or dashboarding and all this kind of stuff. I'm sure, Carl, you're well aware how long things take to develop. And yes, we'd love to have them immediately, but it's just not going to happen immediately. It's going to take a little time. Let's see.
So, Julian, on the reporting side, we do have an intermediate solution for that where you can quite successfully implement both the designer and the viewer inside a Blazor application.
All right. Okay. Instead of writing inline server code with the @code tag, you showed us how to do that. Anyway, the code can be put in a code component. You did that. Brilliant. There are several questions about Azure and SignalR and server-side and limits and how is it, has Microsoft done any research on that kind of thing?
They have, and I mentioned it before. They did a sort of a stress test where they had an application, a real application, where they wanted to test for appropriate latency, which is under 200 milliseconds, round trip from button click to result. And in a standard non-Azure SignalR client, but all in one box, the VM, they tried one with, I think 3.5 gigs of RAM and one CPU. They were able to support 5,000 concurrent users. And when they upped that to 4 virtual CPUs and 14 gigs of RAM, they were able to support 20,000 concurrent users.
Wow.
Comfortably. And this is a real application. And I believe that they said there was only 165K of overhead per client.
Mm-hmm.
There was about 85K of overhead per client just out of the box, just using the counter app, right? But
Right.
once you add your own code and your own state in there, right, now
Okay.
you've got those issues.
And just to make sure, you do not have to use Azure for your server. You can, as you just said, basically have a big box in your server room, and that
Mhm.
will be able to serve up a Blazor app to all of your clients around the world.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Another thing I got to mention is that if you're going to deploy it on Azure, you're going to use an app service, right? It's just another ASP.NET Core application, but you do have to turn on WebSockets, which is off by default.
Oh, okay. That's a good point. Good point.
Yep. So that's in the app service properties and configuration, and it's just a little switch. You turn it on. You've got WebSockets.
So, yeah, oh, that's an interesting question. Can we port Xamarin apps to this format?
Oh, I'm so
know
glad
that?
you asked that question.
No,
You will-
somebody asked it. Basically, Stacy asked this question. So, can we?
You
port
will be able to. There is an initiative called the mobile bindings for Blazor, and you can just go Google Bing that. And essentially what they've got is Xamarin Forms bindings that you would use the Xamarin Forms XAML and use the component model of Blazor. So you kind of get the best of both worlds there.
No,
I should also say that there's so much work going on here. There's another initiative Steve Sanderson has started to do what Electron does. You know what Electron is, right? Slack.
Yeah.
It's an Electron. Slack is big and slow. I'm sorry. Electron is big and slow. Slack by extension is big and slow. So Steve Sanderson basically wrote this very small, very fast alternative called a web window. And I think I got a link right here. Let me see if I can bring it up. Yeah, web window.
Oh, wow.
So this is a cross-platform web view library for .NET Core. He's got a Hello World example, and he shows screenshots of it running on Windows, on Mac, and on Linux.
Wow.
And then what's cool here, and he actually shows hosting a Blazor app in web window. Look at the difference in size. Just take that in for a second.
Amazing. That is, that's just, wow. Okay.
Yeah. Then there's also another...
Half the size at least.
I know, yeah, it's crazy. Now there's also another thing going on called WASI, the WebAssembly System Interface. So WebAssembly is a virtual machine, right? So it doesn't know anything about the host operating system that it's on, but this is an initiative to make a standard interface between different operating systems and WebAssembly so you can actually run it outside the browser.
Mm-hmm.
Again, this is really like bleeding edge stuff. It's very, very new, but just all the stuff that people are doing and thinking about just makes me really think that we're at this momentous occasion here where for the first time, real languages other than JavaScript can run in the browser. And I think, I'm not saying JavaScript's going away by any means because it's, years and years of development, but JavaScript was never meant to be an enterprise level language. It was created in a weekend. It really was. And just read Doug Crockford's JavaScript, The Good Parts. It's a thick book, but he does a lot of apologizing and a lot of slamming, and ways to get around the limitations of JavaScript. I mean, TypeScript is a great start, but ultimately you've got JavaScript underneath it.
Another question is, what's the timetable for releases from Microsoft this year? You've mentioned May. That's when Blazor client and server side are going to be released. Are any other?
Well, they're not going to be released. They said it will be baked in May.
Baked.
In other words,
Baked.
you can count on the code not to change. Yeah.
Sounds like me in the kitchen. It'll be baked.
Yeah.
And it comes out and, right. Okay, and there's something happening in November. Is that .NET Core 5, I believe?
Well, it's just going to be called .NET 5. There will be no more .NET Windows and .NET Core. They'll be merged together, and you'll just have .NET 5. So that is where Blazor WebAssembly is targeted to be released.
One last one is authentication and authorization. Obviously, we're showing very simple examples here.
Yes.
Is there anything new or worrisome about authentication and authorization?
No, there's nothing new and worrisome about it.
To the programming side, not necessarily to the users.
There's nothing worrisome about it. It does require a bit of thought and a bit of code. The demo that I'm showing on the Blazor Roadshow shows how to use an API controller to issue JOT tokens and then store them in local storage. And the app works on both the client and the server. And I'd be happy to show that to you if you'd like to see it.
Sure. I was just going to say, if you want to see this, go and see Carl at one of his stops on the roadshow.
Yes, absolutely. I believe it's right here. Flying by the seat of my pants here, but okay.
Absolutely. Okay, everybody, this is unrehearsed with regard to the webinar.
It's after the 1 hour session, so it doesn't matter.
Okay.
And these squiggles here just happen. I mean, this is the same kind of architecture that I have that I just showed you, where I'm developing both the client and the server side at the same time.
Got you.
But I'm using, obviously, I have an API to serve the data because you need that. And I'm also using authentication to, register and to log in.
I see.
So let's see. Let's see. So I can register here, Carl at block.com, and I think I've already done that. Let me do Carl at franklins.net and E at SSWORD1, E at SSWORD1. I don't know, it just came to me.
Yeah.
But it satisfies all the requirements. So this is a register page that's calling out to an API. Okay, and now it brings me back, after registering, it brings me back to log in. So I want to log in as Carl at franklins.net. E at SSWORD1. And as you could see before, before I was logged in, I couldn't see anything. I couldn't do anything.
Right, got you.
If I'm logged out, there's an authorized view here that says, you're not authorized, so this is the UI that you get. If you are authorized, then you get all this other stuff. And, this is the stuff that we replaced with the
grid.
DevExpress grids and made it so much easier. But, look, I've got the object picker, this generic picker right here, for example. So there you go. There's authorization. I mean, you can see the result of it. I mean, you can go through briefly, I suppose, the different pieces of it. But I would recommend that you check out Chris Sainty, Sainty. He's got a series of blog posts on doing auth, and that I was sanctioned to steal his code for this.
Okay.
And, it's really good. So, yeah, on the client, you have an auth service that calls register and log in. The APIs, where you've got register control and accounts controller for registration, and then you've got a login controller that delivers the JOT token. And on the client side, then you have an authentication state provider that uses local storage to store that and retrieve it. And in the UI, you've got, let's see here, where's my pages? Pages in the UI, right? Right, I've got an authorized view, and if I'm authorized, I can see all this stuff. And if I'm not authorized, please register or log in and use this app. So authentication, authorization, yes, absolutely doable, works on both client side and server side.
And in fact, if you go to, I've just looked it up, chrissainty.com, you'll be able to read what he has to say about Blazor, including the authorization. Yeah,
He's a very smart guy.
Yeah, CHRISSAINTY.com. Okay, and I think with that one, let's call back Amanda. We've been doing pretty well here, 70 minutes so far. Amanda?
Yes. Hi, Julian. All right, everybody. Like I mentioned before, today's webinar will be available later today on our DevExpress YouTube channel. I posted that link in the chat box, and I'll maybe pop it in there again. While you're on our YouTube channel, please subscribe and ring the bell so that you're notified when we release new content. You will also get a follow-up email with a link to this recording if you or your account has opted in for notifications from DevExpress. I do know a lot of people were unable to join the webinar because we did max out our attendance. This was a very popular topic and speaker, so if your colleagues missed out on a seat, they will get an email with access to that recording. Also, for any of you in Portland, Redmond, Salt Lake City, Omaha, Des Moines, and more, visit blazorroadshow.com, blazorroadshow.com to register for a live Blazor presentation given by Carl with DevExpress swag and dinner. Again, that's blazorroadshow.com. I'll post that link in the chat as well. And that is it for this one. Thank you so much to Carl, Julian, and Paul. Thank you all for joining us. And of course, thank you for choosing DevExpress. Bye-bye.